What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my rankings for the origin characters in Baldur's Gate 3, as I've gotten pretty familiar with them over the course of almost 2 full playthroughs, as I am at the end of the second one now, with probably only a day or so left. With that in mind, I've had some experience with these characters, and I've formed a pretty full opinion on them all one way or another, though I do want to stress that that is what this is. This is merely my opinions on these characters, and while I think all of them are good to some degree, naturally, I like some more than others because that's how opinions work. With that in mind though, as we're moving through these and talking about them a little bit, there might be some light spoilers here and there. I'm not going to go like full detail into their individual stories or anything outside of maybe some vague allusions. For the most part, we're going to be keeping it to their Act 1 stuff outside of very general information. But nonetheless, there will be some light spoilers in here almost certainly, so you have been warned. With that in mind, let's actually dive fully into this list, and starting from the bottom, we actually have Karlach. Karlach is a tough one to put at the bottom, to be honest with you, because I actually really enjoyed all of her dialogue for various situations. The problem with Karlach is that she very much so, in my opinion, feels like she was added last. Obviously, I don't have full details on this, but her story content compared to everyone else seems fairly minimal, but her dialogue interactions are incredibly top-notch and through the roof. And while she's funny in a lot of situations, her story just really underwhelmed me. She is a tiefling fresh out of Avernus, the first layer of hell where she fought in the Blood War, and she has an infernal engine for a heart, which comes with its own unique problems, which is such a cool setup for a story, and for me it just doesn't feel like they stuck the landing on it. That said, her personality is great, so credit where it's due. Second to last, we have Astarion. Bit of an opposite day with Karlach here. I find Astarion incredibly grating as a personality, but his story was interesting enough that he eked out slightly above Karlach here, but it was very close. Now, whereas Karlach is, despite her heritage, a very much so good person who prefers it when you do good things, Astarion, being a vampire spawn who, thanks to the story setup of Baldur's Gate 3, has managed to escape his master after hundreds of years of confinement, is now an incredibly selfish person only looking out for themselves, to put it mildly. Though, like all origin characters really, his story gets pretty interesting by the end of it, or at least it starts to ramp up if you keep him around long enough, and the implications of the things he is struggling with internally about everything going on was much more compelling to me than Karlach's story ultimately was. And for me at least, Astarion's story and how some of that peels back some layers of his personality salvages what is left of a character that makes a very poor impression, because beyond that he annoys me in just about every sense of the word. Third up, however, we have Gale, our resident wizard, who is dealing with a sort of magical problem that might just cause him to burst into an explosion and kill everyone around him. Unless, of course, he consumes raw magical energy. An interesting enough setup, but Gale is kind of middle of the pack here because he is a pretty standard personality, in my opinion, combined with a story that's pretty interesting. Because his story involves a lot of the lore surrounding an ancient empire called Netheril, and there's a lot of cool stuff going on there, and his story was incredibly interesting, but his personality was just super average. And compared to the rest of the party, Gale is what I would consider neutral. While he generally prefers you to do good things, if the ends justify the means, you can get away with just about anything with Gale in the party. And it was pretty interesting to see his rather, let's say, shaky morals apply to situations across the entire game that, combined with a really interesting story, makes him, again, just kind of middle of the pack. He didn't really wow me, but it was interesting to see his character development, and his story was interesting, which is more than I can say for the previous 2 entries. That, though, does bring us to our 4th one, and this is Shadowheart. Shadowheart is pretty much exactly what I thought she was going to be. She is, of course, our resident goth girlfriend, but she is also a cleric of Shar, the goddess of darkness, and she was sent on a holy mission to bring a relic to a certain place, and she is shrouded in darkness and mystery. However, the thing is, if you pay any amount of attention to her and also know a little bit about D&D lore and who Shar is locked in an eternal war with, you see everything about Shadowheart's stuff coming a mile away. by the time her big plot thing had happened, I had pretty much assumed that was going to happen from the first few hours of the game itself, so it was just not a surprise in any way. However, it was still pretty good. So while nothing about her story was a surprise in any way, it was nonetheless above average. She had a lot of big story moments that still managed to come across as really well done in spite of you probably knowing where they're going ahead of time. But one thing I really liked about Shadowheart in particular is how she interacts with all of the other companions in the party, because as a cleric of a god of darkness, secrets, absence, loss, her interactions with other people in the camp and everything can be very funny and borderline incredibly hostile sometimes in ways that might surprise you a little bit. So on one hand, I could see some people completely writing her off and not being interested in it at all, because yeah, fair enough. But to me, Shadowheart is like fantasy junk food. You pretty much know what you're gonna get as soon as you meet her, but you know, it's still pretty good. That, however, brings us to our 5th entry with Wyll. So for starters, Wyll got a few rewrites from his original time in early access. However, the core of it still remains largely the same. He is a warlock in a pact with a fiend, which is where he has gotten some of his powers from and why he is known as the Blade of the Frontiers. From there, it only gets more and more complicated, with him having to make a surprising amount of very difficult decisions in service to the pact he agreed to, and watching Wyll, who uses my favorite class admittedly as a warlock, go through these struggles and have to figure out the morally right thing, if you want to put it that way, to do in all these situations, where in many ways he's just struggling to do the right thing, even if it's leading him down a quite dark path in many cases. But amidst the main story of the game, which is already tense enough, watching someone struggle with a devil's bargain, with again a few just god-awful choices that have to be made, was really, really great to me. And admittedly, I'm a sucker for warlocks, sue me. Though I will say, ironically, because Wyll is a warlock, I am inclined to use him less in my party most of the time, because while I really do enjoy his story, that's my favorite class, so if I'm going to play 9 out of 10, I'm the warlock, so I don't need you around. And if I respec him out of his class, then suddenly his story doesn't make any sense, which is a personal struggle I have with the guy. But ultimately, my favorite class combined with some great story moments in the later parts of the game are what rocketed him from pretty close to the bottom from his early access version to here towards the top now. Though that does bring us with the last of the regular origin characters, which is Lae'zel, our Githyanki fighter, who is a hot-headed zealot for her queen Vlaakith, who the Githyanki serve in their quest to destroy mind flayers, which puts her right at the forefront of the story, of course. And the fact that Lae'zel is at the top of this list in terms of the full-on characters is quite the surprise to me. I really didn't like her, to be honest with you, as I imagine a lot of people have experienced when you first run into her, because she is hostile, to say the very least. But if you can push through that, she has, in my opinion, the best story of these 6 characters. She also goes through a ton of character development, to where by the end of the game, depending on how you're playing and the choices you make, she can be almost unrecognizable from the person you met in the tutorial section, which, if I had to guess, is why she's the first character you meet. Because if you were to run into this incredibly hostile person after you already had a party going, I don't think you would be inclined to take her along. But if you give her a minute to grow on you, I think it becomes a little more likely, and then you might get to see some of that character progression. So for me, at least, of all of these characters, I think Lae'zel is probably the most impactful for my own tastes, at the very least. But that does leave us with one last character to talk about who does top the list. However, I admit I kind of almost didn't include this in the list because it's a little different, and that is the Dark Urge. The Dark Urge is more of a concept than a character, as this allows us to put our custom character on top of a preset background tied to the story. The Dark Urge is beset by wild impulses to do just truly terrible things that you can choose to either give in to or resist and fight back against to the best of your ability. However, if a dark murderous urge sounds familiar in the Baldur's Gate universe, that is with good reason. And that's all I'll say. But in all seriousness, the Dark Urge story of all of these is, I would say, the best one. It's not really generally recommended for a first playthrough, as the Dark Urge, unlike the rest of these characters, is not a companion you can get. You are either playing as the Dark Urge or they are not there. So if you are playing as them, their story is the best one. Now, I'm going to go a little bit farther, but this next part in comparison to the rest of the video is a bit more spoilery. And while I'm not going to be spoiling everything by any means, you'd definitely be okay to click off here. You wouldn't really miss anything. With that out of the way and people having been properly warned, the way I would like to explain the Dark Urge is this. In Larian's previous game, Divinity Original Sin 2, one of their origin characters, Fane, is generally regarded as the main character of that game, not so much because he literally is, he's not. However, his origin story was so tied to the fundamental telling of the main story of that game that he has become the sort of de facto main character. And that situation is almost exactly the case with the Dark Urge. So while I won't go any farther than that, if you have any experience with the previous Baldur's Gate games and you understand what the Dark Urge's background is, you've pretty much already puzzled this out. And they did such a phenomenal job with it. In fact, the conclusion of the Dark Urge storyline is the moment where I was like, this is a Baldur's Gate game in more than just name. So, if you don't want to count the Dark Urge, or you don't feel that it counts in a list like this, then by all means, just go with the first 6, but if we're including the Dark Urge, it absolutely tops the list. That said, that's going to do it for this video, though I would love to hear everyone else's opinions and feelings about these origin characters down in the comment section below, so by all means, let me know your thoughts and opinions on the subject, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.